Sometimes the most important decisions we make come when we have the least to give. When Mara Henderson saw two exhausted donkeys tied up outside the butcher shop in Cedar Ridge, she knew she was looking at her last dollar's worth of hope. The old mountain woman had come to town for winter supplies, but instead she found herself buying two animals nobody wanted. People shook their heads as she led them up the dusty trail toward her cabin. They thought she'd lost her mind, spending her survival money on creatures bound for slaughter. But Mara knew something about second chances that the townspeople didn't understand. Those two donkeys would teach her lessons about loyalty and survival she never expected. What happens when an act of mercy changes everything you thought you knew about living alone? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dust kicked up by Mara's worn boots mixed with the afternoon heat as she led the two donkeys away from Cedar Ridge's main street. Behind her, the sounds of the frontier town grew distant. The clatter of wagon wheels, the calls of merchants, the steady rhythm of hammers on anvils. Ahead lay the winding mountain trail that would take her home to a cabin she'd shared with no living soul for 5 long years. The older donkey, grey around the muzzle, with eyes that held too much knowledge of hardship, plodded along with resigned dignity. Mara had already started thinking of him as Jake. Something about his weathered face reminded her of her late husband's steady temperament. The younger one, a female with a swollen belly and nervous energy, kept looking back toward town as if hoping this was all some mistake. Penny, Mara decided. She looked like a penny, all worried brown eyes and cautious steps. "Come on now," Mara murmured, the first words she'd spoken aloud in weeks. "Nothing back there for any of us." The trail began its steep ascent through scrub oak and pine, following a creek that would lead them higher into the Colorado Rockies. Mara's weathered hands gripped the lead rope with practiced ease, her body automatically adjusting to the familiar rhythm of mountain walking. She'd made this journey hundreds of times over the past 20 years, first with Thomas when they were young and full of dreams about living off the land, then alone after the fever took him. The wooden cross hanging from a cord around her neck bounced gently against her chest with each step. Thomas had carved it for her during their first winter in the mountains, when the isolation had nearly broken her spirit. "For the times when faith runs thin," he'd said, pressing it into her hands. She'd worn it every day since, though lately it felt more like a weight than a comfort. As they climbed higher, the air grew thinner and cooler. Pine needles carpeted the trail, muffling their footsteps and releasing their sharp, clean scent with each step. Mara breathed deeply, letting the familiar smell wash away the dust and noise of town. Up here, the world made sense. Up here, she didn't have to pretend to be anything other than what she was, a woman who'd learned to survive on her own terms. Jake stumbled slightly on a loose stone, and Mara steadied him with a gentle hand on his neck. His coat was rough and thin, evidence of poor care and insufficient food. She could feel his ribs too clearly beneath her palm. Penny fared better, her pregnancy giving her a rounder appearance, but her eyes held the same weariness that Mara recognized in her own reflection. "You two aren't much to look at, are you?" she said softly. "Well, that makes 3 of us." The afternoon shadows were lengthening by the time they reached the halfway point, where the trail opened onto a small meadow overlooking the valley below. Mara paused here, as she always did, to let the animals rest and to look back at the world she was leaving behind. Cedar Ridge appeared small from this distance, a collection of brown buildings scattered along the valley floor like children's blocks. She'd met Thomas in that town 25 years ago, when she was barely 20, and he was a young veterinarian with dreams of serving the ranchers and farmers of the high country. They'd built their life together, one careful decision at a time. The cabin, the small garden, the quiet routines that sustained them through harsh winters and brief, glorious summers. After Thomas died, Mara had tried to maintain those routines. Thinking structure would see her through the grief, but structure without purpose felt hollow. The garden produced more vegetables than one person could eat. The cabin's second room stood empty. The conversations she'd shared with Thomas became internal monologues that eventually faded into silence. She'd stopped going to town except when absolutely necessary. Stopped maintaining the friendships they'd cultivated over the years. Stopped believing that tomorrow might hold anything different from today. The wooden cross around her neck had become her only companion, a reminder of faith she could no longer feel but couldn't quite abandon. Now, looking down at Jake and Penny as they grazed on the meadow grass, Mara wondered what had possessed her to take on their care. She'd seen animals headed for slaughter before. Life in the mountains taught hard lessons about survival, and she'd learned to accept them. But something about these two, maybe it was Jake's dignity in the face of death, or Penny's protective stance over her unborn foal, had stirred something she'd thought was dead. Foolishness, she muttered, echoing the whispers she'd heard from the townspeople. Old woman losing her mind. But even as she said it, she felt a spark of something she hadn't experienced in years. Purpose, maybe, or just the simple satisfaction of acting on conviction rather than mere habit. The sun was beginning to set when they resumed their climb. The final stretch of trail wound through dense forest, where ancient pines filtered the light into cathedral columns, and the only sounds were their footsteps and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. Mara's cabin sat in a small clearing at the end of this trail, invisible from below and accessible only to those who knew the way. Thomas had chosen the location for its solitude and natural defenses. A spring provided fresh water year-round, and the clearing was large enough for a garden and small pasture. The cabin itself was solid, built from local timber and designed to withstand the fierce mountain winters. It had been their sanctuary, their private corner of the world where they could live according to their own values and rhythms. As they emerged into the clearing, Mara felt the familiar mix of comfort and melancholy that always accompanied her homecoming. The cabin's windows glowed amber in the setting sun, and smoke rose from the chimney where she'd banked the fire before leaving that morning. Everything looked exactly as she'd left it, and exactly as it had looked for 5 years of solitary returns. Jake and Penny stood quietly while she opened the gate to the small pasture behind the cabin. The grass there was thin but adequate, and a lean-to shelter provided protection from wind and rain. It had been built for the milk cow she and Thomas had once kept, but which she'd sold after his death when maintaining it alone became too much work. "This is home," she told the donkeys as she led them through the gate. Such as it is. They moved cautiously into the pasture, sniffing the air and testing the ground beneath their feet. Jake found a patch of clover and began to graze with evident pleasure, the first sign of contentment Mara had seen from him. Penny remained alert, her head high and ears forward, but she too began to sample the grass. Mara filled their water trough from the spring and checked the fence for weak spots. The posts were solid, but the wire would need attention before winter. Another task to add to the growing list of preparations she should have been making, instead of rescuing animals she couldn't afford to feed. Inside the cabin, she lit the oil lamps and stirred the coals in the fireplace back to life. The familiar ritual of evening chores, checking the pantry, planning tomorrow's meals, reviewing the weather signs, usually brought her comfort. Tonight, it only reminded her how precarious her situation had become. Her pantry held enough supplies for one person to survive the winter barely. Flour, beans, preserved meat, a few canned goods purchased with careful budgeting over the summer months. The root cellar contained potatoes, onions, and vegetables from her garden. It would sustain her through the cold months if she was careful and if the winter wasn't unusually long. But feeding 3 mouths instead of 1, and providing hay for 2 donkeys through months of snow, would require resources she didn't have. The 50 cents she'd kept back from her donkey purchase would buy perhaps a week's worth of oats. The nearest hay was in Cedar Ridge, and she'd need at least $10 to buy enough to last the winter. Mara sank into Thomas's old chair by the fireplace, the wooden cross heavy in her palm. The silence of the cabin pressed around her, broken only by the crackling fire and the distant sound of the donkeys moving about their new pasture. For the first time since making her impulsive purchase, she allowed herself to fully consider what she'd done. She'd traded her winter security for 2 animals that would likely die anyway if the cold came early or the snow was deep. She'd committed herself to caring for creatures that would demand food, water, shelter, and medical attention she was ill-equipped to provide. She'd taken responsibility for lives when she was barely managing to sustain her own. And yet, as she sat in the growing darkness, she found she couldn't regret it. For the first time in 5 years, her evening was punctuated by sounds other than wind and settling timber. For the first time since Thomas's death, she was not entirely alone with her thoughts and memories. The wooden cross caught the firelight, its simple lines carved with the love and hope Thomas had put into everything he'd made for her. "For the times when faith runs thin," she whispered, remembering his words. Perhaps this was one of those times, not a crisis of religious faith, but a crisis of faith in her own capacity for love and care. Outside, Jake whinnied softly, and Penny answered with a gentle bray. The sounds carried clearly through the thin mountain air, domestic and peaceful. Tomorrow would bring its challenges, but tonight the cabin felt less empty than it had in years. Mara rose and checked the fire, adding logs to keep it burning through the night. In the morning, she would begin the hard work of figuring out how to keep them all alive until spring. But for now, she was content to listen to the sounds of life beyond her walls and to feel, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that she was needed. Mara woke to the sound of wind howling around the cabin's eaves and the soft patter of something against the windows. In the grey light of early morning, she could see snowflakes swirling past the glass. Not the gentle first snow of late autumn, but the thick, determined flakes of a serious storm. She padded to the window in her bare feet, her breath misting in the sudden cold. The thermometer outside read 28 degrees, and snow was already accumulating on the pasture fence posts. According to Thomas's weather journal, a leather-bound book where he'd recorded 40 years of mountain weather patterns, the first significant snow usually didn't arrive until mid-November. It was barely October. "Too early," she murmured, pulling her shawl tighter. Much too early. In the pasture, Jake and Penny huddled together near the lean-to, their dark shapes barely visible through the falling snow. They looked miserable, their heads down and backs hunched against the wind. The thin grass that had seemed adequate yesterday was now buried beneath a growing blanket of white. Mara dressed quickly in layers: wool socks, heavy pants, flannel shirt, and Thomas's old coat that still smelled faintly of the pipe tobacco he'd favored. She pulled on her boots and stepped outside, gasping as the wind-driven snow stung her face. The storm was worse than it had appeared from inside. Snow was falling at a rate that would accumulate several inches by nightfall, and the wind was strong enough to create drifts. The trail down to Cedar Ridge would be treacherous within hours, and impassable by tomorrow if this continued. She fought her way through the wind to the pasture gate. Jake lifted his head as she approached, and she could see ice crystals forming in his whiskers. Penny stood pressed against his side, shivering despite her thick coat. "Come on, you two," Mara called over the wind. "Let's get you somewhere warmer." She led them to the small barn that had once housed Thomas's workshop. It was drafty and hadn't been used for animals in years, but it would provide shelter from the direct force of the storm. She spread the few armloads of old hay she had stored there, knowing it wouldn't last more than a day or two. As she worked to make them comfortable, Jake began coughing, a deep, rattling sound that spoke of more than just cold. When she ran her hands over his neck and chest, she could feel the heat of fever beneath his winter coat. His breathing was labored, and his eyes held the dull look of illness. "Oh, Jake," she whispered, "you're sick, aren't you?" The old donkey leaned against her touch, and she could feel him trembling with more than cold. Respiratory infection, most likely, brought on by stress and poor conditions at the livestock yard. Thomas would have known exactly what to do. He'd treated dozens of similar cases over his years as a veterinarian. But Thomas was gone, and his medical knowledge had died with him, or had it. Back in the cabin, Mara dug through the chest where she'd stored Thomas's professional belongings after his death. Most of his equipment had been sold or given away, but she'd kept his journals and a few basic supplies. Her hands shook as she pulled out his veterinary bag, unused for 5 years, but still containing bottles of medicines and instruments she only dimly understood. Thomas's treatment journal lay beneath the bag, filled with his careful handwriting documenting years of cases. She flipped through pages of notes about cattle, horses, sheep, and yes, donkeys. Respiratory infections, pneumonia, influenza. The symptoms were described in Thomas's precise hand, along with treatments and dosages. But reading about treatment and administering it were different things entirely. The medicines in the bag were old, their labels faded and potency uncertain. Without Thomas's knowledge and experience, she was as likely to harm Jake as help him. She returned to the barn to find Penny nuzzling Jake's neck while he stood with his head hanging low. The snow was finding its way through gaps in the barn walls, creating small drifts in the corners. The temperature was dropping, and both animals would need more shelter than this old building could provide. "Penny," she said softly, approaching the pregnant donkey. "Let me check on you too." Penny allowed herself to be examined, but Mara's inexperienced hands detected troubling signs. The donkey's belly seemed oddly shaped, and when Mara pressed gently, she felt movement that seemed wrong somehow. Penny's udder was beginning to develop, suggesting the foal might come sooner than expected. Combined with the stress of the storm and change of location, there could be complications. The reality of her situation crashed over her like the cold wind outside. She was trapped on the mountain with 2 sick animals, minimal supplies, and no way to get help. The storm would make the trail impassable for days, maybe weeks, if it was followed by others. Her winter preparations were incomplete, her food stores inadequate for 3 mouths, and she lacked the knowledge to treat the medical problems developing before her eyes. Standing in the drafty barn, watching Jake struggle for breath, while Penny showed signs of a difficult pregnancy, Mara felt the weight of her impulsive decision. Yesterday, buying these animals had seemed like an act of mercy. Today, it looked like a death sentence for all 3 of them. The wind rattled the barn door, and snow swirled through the gaps in the walls. Jake's coughing grew worse, each spasm shaking his thin frame. Penny moved restlessly, clearly uncomfortable and growing more agitated as the storm intensified. Mara closed her eyes and tried to remember Thomas's voice, his calm confidence when faced with sick animals and difficult weather. He'd always said that panic was the enemy of good judgment, that the key to survival was taking problems one at a time and using whatever resources were available. "What would you do?" she whispered to the memory of her husband. The answer came not in words, but in action. She needed to get the animals into the cabin where it was warm, and she could monitor them closely. The space would be tight, but it was better than watching them freeze or sicken in the inadequate shelter of the barn. She led Jake first, coaxing his reluctant steps through the snow to the cabin door. He balked at the threshold, never having been inside a human dwelling, but eventually followed her through. Penny came more easily, perhaps sensing the warmth and safety the cabin offered. Inside, she spread blankets on the floor and positioned the animals near the fireplace. Jake sank down gratefully, his breathing easier in the warm air. Penny remained standing, alert and nervous, but no longer shivering. The cabin felt impossibly small, with 2 donkeys sharing her living space, but it also felt more alive than it had in years. Their presence, their breathing, even their occasional snorts and shuffles, filled the silence that had been her constant companion. As the storm raged outside, Mara sat between the animals and opened Thomas's treatment journal again. If she was going to keep Jake alive, she needed to become a veterinarian, at least for the basics. If she was going to help Penny through what might be a difficult birth, she needed to learn skills she'd never imagined needing. The wooden cross around her neck caught the firelight as she bent over the pages, squinting at Thomas's careful notes about respiratory treatments. Outside, the wind howled and snow piled against the windows. The trail to town disappeared beneath a blanket of white that would keep them isolated for days or weeks. But for the first time since Thomas's death, Mara Henderson was not alone with her fears. She had purpose, responsibility, and creatures depending on her knowledge and courage. The cross felt lighter against her chest as she turned the page and began to read about treating pneumonia in donkeys. The storm had changed everything. What had been a simple act of mercy was now a fight for survival, not just her own, but for the lives she'd chosen to save. As Jake's labored breathing filled the warm cabin and Penny settled carefully onto the blankets beside him, Mara realized there was no going back. They would face whatever came together, or not at all. The old medicine kit lay open on the cabin's wooden table like a surgeon's instruments, bottles and vials catching the lamplight as Mara tried to decipher Thomas's notes. The leather bag had been his most prized possession, accumulated over decades of practice and carefully maintained until the day he died. Now it represented her only hope of saving Jake's life. "Respiratory distress in equines," she read aloud, her finger tracing the familiar handwriting. "Temperature elevation, labored breathing, nasal discharge." Jake exhibited all these symptoms, his condition worsening as the hours passed. Thomas had documented a case from 15 years earlier, a mule with similar symptoms, treated with a combination of steam therapy and careful dosing of expectorants. The treatment had worked, but the margins for error were thin. Too much medicine could be as dangerous as too little. Mara set a large pot of water to boil on the stove, adding pine needles and herbs from her small collection. The aromatic steam would help Jake's breathing, just as Thomas had done for human patients during flu outbreaks. While the water heated, she measured out a small dose of the expectorant, her hands trembling as she calculated Jake's approximate weight against the dosage recommendations. "Easy now," she murmured as she approached the sick donkey. Jake lay on his side near the fireplace, his breathing shallow and rapid. His eyes tracked her movement, and she saw trust there that both humbled and terrified her. The medicine went down easier than she'd expected, mixed with molasses to mask the bitter taste. Jake swallowed obediently, then rested his grey muzzle against her knee. The simple gesture of trust nearly brought tears to her eyes. She positioned the steaming pot near Jake's head, covering both animal and vessel with a large blanket to create a makeshift steam tent. Thomas's journal emphasized the importance of this treatment. The moist, heated air would help break up the congestion in Jake's lungs and ease his breathing. While Jake received his steam therapy, Mara turned her attention to Penny. The pregnant donkey stood near the window, looking out at the continuing snowfall with obvious anxiety. Her sides were more distended than they'd appeared yesterday, and she showed signs of discomfort when she moved. "Let me have a look at you, girl," Mara said softly. Running her hands over Penny's swollen sides, the foal moved actively within, which was encouraging. But Penny's reaction to touch suggested she might be experiencing premature labor pains. According to Thomas's notes on equine pregnancy, donkey foals typically carried for nearly a year. If Penny had been bred in early winter, the foal wouldn't be due until late fall, still weeks away, but stress could trigger early labor, and Penny had certainly experienced enough upheaval in the past few days to upset her system. The change of environment, the early snowstorm, and now being confined in an unfamiliar cabin with a sick companion could easily send her into premature delivery. Mara prepared a comfortable area for Penny near the back of the cabin, spreading clean blankets and positioning supplies she might need if the birth came sooner than expected. Thomas's obstetric notes were detailed but daunting. He'd assisted with dozens of difficult births, but always with proper equipment and assistance. The storm showed no signs of abating. Snow continued to fall steadily, and the wind had picked up, rattling the cabin's windows and sending occasional puffs of smoke back down the chimney. The trail to town was certainly impassable now, and even if it weren't, the journey would be impossible with two animals in distress. As evening approached, Jake showed signs of improvement. His breathing was easier after the steam treatment, and his temperature seemed to be dropping. He accepted small amounts of water and even nibbled at some hay, the first food he'd taken since the storm began. "That's it, old fellow," Mara encouraged, stroking his neck. Thomas always said the first day was the hardest. The mention of her husband's name brought back memories of other animals they'd nursed through illnesses together. Thomas had possessed an intuitive understanding of animal suffering, combined with practical knowledge gained through experience. She had neither, but she was learning to trust her instincts and to listen carefully to what the animals were telling her. Penny's restlessness increased as night fell. She couldn't seem to find a comfortable position, alternately standing and lying down. Her breathing was rapid but not labored like Jake's. This was the breathing of an animal in discomfort rather than illness. "Are you thinking about having that baby?" Mara asked, settling beside Penny with Thomas's obstetric manual open in her lap. "It's a little early, don't you think?" As if in response, Penny's sides contracted visibly, and she let out a low grunt of discomfort. Early labor, without question. The foal was coming whether they were ready or not. Mara spent the night moving between her two patients. Every hour she prepared fresh steam for Jake and monitored his breathing. His condition continued to improve slowly. The crisis had passed, but he would need continued care to fully recover. Penny's labor progressed in fits and starts, typical of a first-time mother according to Thomas's notes. The contractions were irregular but increasing in intensity. By dawn, it was clear the foal would arrive within hours. The cabin had become a makeshift veterinary hospital, filled with the sounds of animal breathing, the rustle of straw and blankets, and the constant whisper of wind around the eaves. Snow continued to fall, now several feet deep and showing no signs of stopping. Mara moved through her morning routine with new purpose. She prepared warm mashes for both animals, administered Jake's second dose of medicine, and readied supplies for the impending birth. Her movements were careful and deliberate, guided by Thomas's detailed instructions and her own growing confidence. "We're going to get through this," she told her charges as she stoked the fire and put fresh water on to heat. "All of us." Jake's recovery gave her hope, but Penny's labor concerned her. First births were often difficult, and the stress of the storm and strange surroundings wouldn't help. Thomas's notes emphasized the importance of patience and gentle assistance. Too much intervention could be as dangerous as too little. As the morning light grew stronger, filtering through the snow-covered windows, Mara realized she was talking more than she had in years. The animals seemed to respond to her voice, Jake's ears swiveling to follow her movements, and Penny calming when she spoke in soothing tones. The silence that had defined her life for 5 years was broken not just by animal sounds, but by her own voice as she provided the comfort and encouragement these creatures needed. In caring for them, she was rediscovering parts of herself she'd thought were lost forever. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the warm cabin, life was asserting itself with quiet determination. Jake was healing. Penny was preparing to bring new life into the world. And Mara was learning that sometimes the most important medicine is simply refusing to give up. By the 3rd day of the storm, Mara's carefully rationed supplies were running dangerously low. The beans and flour that should have lasted her through November were nearly gone, consumed by the need to provide warm, nourishing meals for 3 instead of 1. Jake's appetite was returning as he recovered, and Penny required extra nutrition to support her pregnancy and impending labor. Mara stood before her depleted pantry in the grey morning light, taking inventory with a growing sense of urgency. Half a bag of flour, perhaps 2 cups of beans, a small amount of preserved meat, and some root vegetables from the cellar. Enough to sustain 1 person for a week, perhaps 2 with careful rationing, but not enough to support 3 lives through what was shaping up to be an extended period of isolation. She fingered the wedding ring on her left hand, its simple gold band worn smooth by 25 years of wear. Thomas had saved for months to buy it, working extra hours at the veterinary practice in Denver before they moved to the mountains. It was the most valuable thing she owned, and in town it would bring enough money to buy supplies for the rest of the winter. But reaching town meant leaving Jake and Penny alone for at least 2 days, assuming the trail was passable. Jake was improving but still weak, and Penny's labor could begin at any moment. The risk of leaving them was enormous, but the risk of staying without adequate food might be greater. "What would you do, Thomas?" she asked the empty cabin, her voice echoing in the silence. The answer came not from memory but from observation. Jake had managed to stand and move to the window, where he gazed out at the snow-covered landscape with alert interest. His breathing was nearly normal, and the fever had broken during the night. He was far from fully recovered, but no longer in immediate danger. Penny, however, was a different concern. Her labor had intensified during the early morning hours, with contractions coming more regularly and increasing in strength. She alternated between restless pacing and periods of lying down, her sides heaving with effort. According to Thomas's notes, active labor in donkeys could last anywhere from hours to days, and there was no predicting when the foal would actually arrive. Mara made her decision with the practical wisdom that mountain living had taught her. She would prepare for Penny's delivery as thoroughly as possible, then venture down the mountain to trade her ring for supplies. It was a calculated risk, but one that offered the best chance of long-term survival for all of them. She spent the morning gathering everything Penny might need during labor: clean blankets, warm water, soft cloths, and the basic instruments from Thomas's veterinary bag. His obstetric notes were precise about what could go wrong and how to assist if necessary, though she prayed for a straightforward delivery that wouldn't require her inexperienced intervention. "You're going to have to be strong while I'm gone," she told Penny, stroking the donkey's neck as another contraction rippled through her sides. "I'll be back as quick as I can, but you might have to manage without me for a day or two." Penny seemed to understand, pressing her muzzle against Mara's shoulder with surprising gentleness. The trust in that simple gesture strengthened Mara's resolve. These animals had chosen to depend on her, and she would not let them down. The snow had finally stopped falling, though the wind continued to sculpt it into deep drifts across the landscape. The trail down the mountain would be treacherous, but not impossible for someone who knew the way. Mara had walked it in snow before, during the years when Thomas's practice required emergency calls regardless of weather. She prepared for the journey with methodical care, packing light but bringing essential items: rope in case she needed to navigate around fallen trees or dangerous sections, a small axe for clearing obstacles, and warm clothes that would see her through a night outdoors if necessary. Most importantly, she wrapped her wedding ring carefully in a piece of cloth and tucked it into her inner pocket. "I'll be back," she promised Jake and Penny as she prepared to leave. "You two look after each other." Jake had positioned himself near Penny, as if understanding that she needed companionship and protection. His recovery was remarkable. Thomas had always said animals possessed healing powers that humans could learn from. The old donkey's resilience gave Mara hope that they would all find ways to survive the challenges ahead. The journey down the mountain tested every skill Mara had learned in 20 years of mountain living. The familiar trail was transformed by snow into a treacherous path that required constant vigilance. Several times she had to detour around fallen trees or areas where the snow had drifted too deep for safe passage. But the physical challenge was welcome after 3 days of anxious waiting. Her body remembered the rhythm of mountain travel, her muscles settling into the steady pace that would carry her safely down the steep terrain. The cold air cleared her mind and strengthened her determination. She thought about Thomas as she walked, remembering his quiet confidence in the face of difficulties. He taught her that most problems could be solved with patience, observation, and willingness to adapt. The current crisis was simply another problem to be solved, one step at a time. The ring in her pocket represented more than monetary value. It was her connection to the life she'd built with Thomas, the symbol of promises made and kept. Trading it felt like severing another tie to her past, but she was beginning to understand that holding on to the past was different from honoring it. Thomas would have approved of her decision. He'd always put the welfare of animals above material concerns, and he would have understood the necessity of sacrifice when lives were at stake. The ring was just metal. What it represented, love, commitment, care for vulnerable creatures, would continue regardless of whether she wore it. As the trail leveled out and she caught her first glimpse of Cedar Ridge in the valley below, Mara felt a surge of determination. She would trade the ring for supplies, return to the mountain as quickly as possible, and find ways to stretch their resources through the winter. There had to be food sources she hadn't considered, survival techniques she hadn't explored. The wooden cross around her neck bounced gently with each step, but now it felt less like a burden and more like a reminder. Thomas had carved it during their first difficult winter, when they'd learned to survive on determination and faith in each other. Now she was learning to survive on determination and faith in herself. The snow-covered town appeared peaceful in the afternoon light. Smoke rising from chimneys and the main street showing signs of recent activity despite the storm. Somewhere in those buildings was the help she needed: food, supplies, and perhaps advice from others who'd faced similar challenges. Behind her, the mountain trail disappeared into the forest, leading back to a cabin where two animals waited for her return. The responsibility felt heavy, but no longer overwhelming. She had purpose, and purpose, she was discovering, was its own form of strength. The storm that had seemed to end returned with vengeance just hours after Mara's departure, trapping her in Cedar Ridge and covering the mountain trail with fresh snow that made travel impossible. She spent the night in the hotel, pacing her small room and staring out at the swirling whiteness. Knowing that Jake and Penny were facing the crisis alone, the frayed rope she'd used to secure the animals seemed inadequate now, a symbol of how tenuous their situation had become. Everything holding their small family together, supplies, shelter, her own knowledge, felt as fragile as that worn hemp cord that might snap under too much pressure. By morning, the new snow had added another foot to the already treacherous conditions. Tom Bradley, the hotel keeper, shook his head when Mara inquired about the trail. "Nobody's getting up that mountain for days, Mrs. Henderson. Maybe a week or more, if this weather keeps up." The trading had gone better than she'd hoped. Her wedding ring brought enough money to purchase substantial supplies: flour, beans, preserved meat, and even some hay for the animals. But the supplies were useless if she couldn't reach the cabin, and with each passing hour, her anxiety for Jake and Penny grew. She used the enforced delay to gather information from other mountain residents who'd come to town before the storm. Sarah Collins, whose ranch sat at a slightly lower elevation, had dealt with premature births in her livestock. "First babies are the hardest," Sarah confided over coffee in the hotel's dining room. "But animals have been managing without us for millions of years. Trust your donkey's instincts. They usually know what to do." Dr. Martinez, who had taken over much of Thomas's former territory, offered medical advice that both comforted and worried her. "Donkeys are hardy animals, but complications can arise quickly. If the labor lasts more than 12 hours without progress, or if the foal is positioned wrong," he didn't need to finish. They both knew the risks. On the third day of her enforced stay in town, Mara woke to silence. The wind had died, and no snow fell past her window. The storm had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a transformed landscape of pristine white that sparkled in the morning sun. She was packed and ready within minutes. The purchased supplies loaded into a borrowed pack frame that would distribute the weight more evenly for the climb. Tom Bradley tried to dissuade her. The trail would be treacherous, and she was traveling alone. But nothing could keep her from returning to the cabin. The ascent took twice as long as usual. Snow had drifted across the trail in places, forcing her to break new path through thigh-deep powder. Several times she had to rest, not from exhaustion, but from the anxiety that gripped her chest like a physical weight. 3 days was an eternity when animals were in distress. The forest around her was transformed into a winter wonderland, with snow loading the pine boughs until they drooped like cathedral arches. Under other circumstances, she might have appreciated the beauty. Today, it represented only obstacles between her and the animals who depended on her. As she climbed higher, she began to listen for sounds from the direction of her cabin. The bark of a fox, the call of a hawk, any indication that life continued in the clearing ahead. But the snow-muffled forest revealed nothing of what she might find at journey's end. The final approach to the cabin filled her with both relief and terror. Smoke rose from the chimney, indicating that the fire she'd banked before leaving had somehow sustained itself. But no sounds came from the pasture, and she couldn't see the animals through the snow-covered windows. She burst through the cabin door with a force that rattled the walls, then stopped short at the scene before her. Jake stood near the fireplace, alert and obviously recovered from his illness. Penny lay on a bed of blankets near the back wall, and nestled against her side was a small, dark foal with impossibly long legs and bright, curious eyes. "Oh my," Mara whispered, dropping her pack and approaching slowly. "Look what you've done." The foal was tiny but perfectly formed, with Penny's coloring and an alert expression that suggested intelligence and good health. It couldn't have been more than a day old. Still unsteady on its legs, but vigorous in its movements, Penny lifted her head at Mara's approach, and the relief in her eyes was unmistakable. She had managed the birth alone, guided by instincts millions of years old, but she was exhausted from the effort. The afterbirth had been expelled cleanly, and both mother and foal showed no signs of complications. "You beautiful, clever girl," Mara murmured, kneeling beside the new family. "You did it all by yourself." The foal struggled to its feet at the sound of her voice, swaying on uncertain legs, but determined to investigate this new presence. Its first steps were wobbly but purposeful, and when it nuzzled Mara's outstretched hand, she felt tears streaming down her cheeks. Jake approached and nosed the foal gently, his recovery complete enough that he could take on the role of protector and teacher. The three animals formed a natural family unit, with Jake as the wise elder, Penny as the devoted mother, and the foal as the promise of new beginnings. As Mara unpacked the supplies she'd purchased with her wedding ring, she realized that more had changed during her 3-day absence than just the arrival of a new life. The cabin felt different, warmer, more alive, filled with purpose and meaning that had been absent for 5 years. She had left as a woman desperately trying to save 2 animals she barely knew. She returned to find herself part of a family that had formed in her absence, but included her as an essential member. The frayed rope that had seemed so inadequate now appeared strong enough to hold them all together, binding them with connections that went deeper than mere ownership or responsibility. The foal, she would call him Hope, she decided, represented everything she had thought lost forever. New life, fresh possibilities, the courage to believe that tomorrow might be different from yesterday. As she prepared a nourishing meal for Penny and fresh bedding for the foal, Mara felt the wooden cross around her neck, settling into a more comfortable position against her chest. Faith, she was learning, wasn't about believing in certainties. It was about acting with love despite uncertainties, about nurturing life even when the outcome was unclear. The storm had tested that faith and found it stronger than she'd imagined. Outside, the snow continued to sparkle in the afternoon sun, but inside the cabin, spring had already arrived in the form of a newborn foal, taking his first uncertain steps into a world where he would be cherished and protected. The rope that bound them all together was no longer frayed. It was woven from strands of need, care, and the quiet miracle of surviving together. Winter settled over the mountain with a persistence that challenged even Mara's experience with harsh seasons. February brought temperatures that rarely climbed above 0, and the snowpack around the cabin reached the lower edges of the windows. But inside, the warmth of their small sanctuary sustained both bodies and spirits through the longest. Coldest nights, Hope, as Mara had named the foal, grew stronger each day despite the challenging conditions. His legs, impossibly long at birth, began to support him with increasing confidence. He would nurse from Penny, then explore every corner of the cabin with the fearless curiosity of youth. often ending up tangled in blankets or investigating the contents of Mara's sewing basket. "You're going to be trouble," Mara told him one morning as she untangled him from a skein of yarn. But good trouble, I think. The torn photograph she'd discovered while organizing Thomas's belongings lay on the kitchen table, its edges carefully mended with tape. In it, she and Thomas stood before their newly built cabin, young and full of dreams about their mountain life. For 5 years, looking at that image had brought only pain. Now, watching Hope play near the same spot where the photograph was taken, she felt something she hadn't experienced since Thomas's death. Continuity. The past wasn't separate from the present. It was woven into it like threads in a tapestry. Thomas's love, his knowledge, his gentle way with animals, all of it lived on in the care she provided Jake, Penny, and Hope. The photograph no longer represented what was lost, but what endured. Spring couldn't come soon enough, though Mara had learned to appreciate the enforced intimacy of their winter quarters. Living in close contact with the animals had taught her subtleties of behavior and communication she'd never noticed before. She could predict Jake's moods from the set of his ears, understand Penny's needs from the way she positioned herself, and interpret Hope's playful energy levels throughout the day. But the supplies she'd purchased with her wedding ring, carefully rationed though they were, wouldn't last until the snow melted. By her calculations, they had perhaps 6 weeks of food remaining, enough to reach early April if she was very careful, but not enough to sustain them until the mountain passes opened for travel to town. The solution came to her gradually, born from observation of how the animals had adapted to cabin life. Jake had developed a remarkable ability to sense weather changes, becoming restless before storms and calm when clear weather approached. Penny had established routines that maximized the limited space, finding corners where she could rest without interfering with daily activities. Hope seemed to understand boundaries without being taught, avoiding the cooking area and the stack of precious firewood. If the animals could adapt so completely to an environment that was unnatural for them, perhaps she could adapt to finding resources that were unconventional for human survival. The mountain had supported wildlife through countless harsh winters. There had to be ways to tap into those same resources. Thomas's journals contained more than just veterinary notes. His careful documentation of mountain life included observations about plants, weather patterns, and the behavior of wild animals. One entry, written during a particularly difficult winter early in their marriage, described how indigenous peoples had survived in these mountains using resources that newcomers overlooked. "The inner bark of aspen trees," she read aloud to her attentive audience. "It can be ground into flour when properly prepared. High in nutrients and surprisingly palatable." Jake's ears pricked forward at the sound of her voice, and Hope abandoned his exploration of a cardboard box to listen. Even Penny, usually focused on her own concerns, seemed interested in this one-sided conversation that had become their evening routine. Other entries described winter hunting techniques, methods for preserving meat without salt, and ways to supplement calories with nuts and seeds cached by forest animals. Thomas had never needed to use this survival knowledge, but he'd recorded it with the thoroughness that characterized all his work. "We're going to become mountain people in ways we never imagined," Mara told her companions. "What do you think about that?" The practical preparations for extended survival began the next morning. Using Thomas's detailed drawings, Mara identified aspen trees near the cabin and began the careful process of harvesting inner bark. The work was difficult in deep snow, but she found it oddly satisfying to engage with the mountain environment in such an immediate way. Hope accompanied her on these expeditions, his boundless energy making light work of breaking trail through the snow. He seemed to understand that these journeys were important, staying close to Mara and alerting her to sounds or movements in the forest that she might have missed. Jake and Penny remained in the cabin during these forays, conserving energy and maintaining the warmth that was essential to their survival. But their presence was felt even during her absence. Mara found herself hurrying back, not just because of practical concerns, But because the cabin felt incomplete without all four of them together, the inner bark processing required skills she'd never imagined needing. Thomas's notes were precise, but couldn't convey the experience of scraping bark, drying it properly, and grinding it into usable flour. She ruined several batches through inexperience before achieving results that were both nutritious and palatable, mixed with their remaining wheat flour and formed into simple cakes, cooked on the cabin's wood stove. The aspen bark flour provided calories that would stretch their supplies significantly. The taste was unusual but not unpleasant, and Hope seemed to enjoy the scraps she offered him as treats as February gave way to March. Their little family settled into rhythms that felt both sustainable and deeply satisfying. The morning routine of checking on each animal, preparing meals, and maintaining the fire was punctuated by afternoon expeditions for bark harvesting and evening sessions with Thomas's journals. Searching for additional survival techniques, Hope's growth was remarkable, his foal coat giving way to the darker coloring he would wear as an adult. His personality emerged daily, curious, affectionate, and remarkably intelligent. He learned to respond to his name, to come when called, and to understand simple commands that made their shared living space more manageable. "You're going to be special," Mara told him one evening as he dozed beside the fire, his head resting against her knee. "I can feel it in my bones." The photograph on the table caught the lamplight, and for the first time in years, Mara looked at it without pain. Thomas's smile seemed to approve of the scene before her. The cabin filled with life, the successful adaptation to circumstances they'd never anticipated. The quiet satisfaction of survival, achieved through love and determination. Spring was still weeks away, but the worst of winter was behind them. They had food, shelter, warmth, and each other. Most importantly, they had purpose and the growing confidence that they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. Outside, the wind continued its eternal conversation with the pine trees, and snow fell softly in the lamplight beyond the windows. But inside the cabin, surrounded by the gentle breathing of animals who had become family, Mara Henderson felt richer than she had when her wedding ring still circled her finger. The hidden deed emerged from between the pages of Thomas's oldest journal, like a secret waiting 5 years to be discovered. Mara had been searching for his notes on early spring foraging when the yellow document slipped free, its legal language immediately catching her attention in the lamplight. "Mineral rights assignment and transfer," she read aloud, her voice echoing strangely in the quiet cabin. Hope looked up from where he was napping near the fire, his dark eyes reflecting curiosity at this sudden change in her tone. The document was dated 15 years earlier, signed by Thomas and witnessed by lawyers in Denver. It granted him, and by extension her as his widow, exclusive mineral rights to their mountain property, including all precious metals, rare earth elements, and extractable resources found beneath the surface of the described acreage. Mara's hands trembled as she read the technical language that outlined boundaries extending far beyond their modest cabin site. The property rights covered nearly 2,000 acres of mountain terrain, including areas she'd walked countless times without, realizing they held potential wealth beneath their surface. But it was the attached geological survey that made her sink into Thomas's chair with a sharp intake of breath. The report, conducted by a respected Denver firm, identified significant copper deposits and traces of precious metals throughout their land. At current market prices, the document estimated the mineral wealth could be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered to Thomas's memory, staring at his familiar signature at the bottom of the deed. The answer came in the form of a letter tucked behind the geological survey, written in Thomas's careful handwriting but never sent. It was addressed to her, dated just weeks before his final illness. "My dearest Mara," she read, her voice breaking slightly. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have found the secret I kept to protect our peace. The mining company has been pressing me for months to sell these rights, offering sums that would make us wealthy beyond our needs. The letter continued in Thomas's measured prose, explaining his decision to hide the mineral wealth from her during his lifetime. You fell in love with this mountain for its beauty and solitude, not its potential for commercial exploitation. I feared that knowledge of this wealth would change how you saw our home, would make it difficult to find peace in the simple life we built together. But Thomas's letter revealed deeper concerns. The mining company, Apex Extraction Corporation, had been increasingly aggressive in their pursuit of mineral rights throughout the region. They had approached Thomas multiple times with offers that grew more substantial with each visit, and their representatives had made it clear they would find ways to access the minerals with or without his cooperation. I have hidden this burden from you because I love you, the letter continued. But I fear that after my death they will approach you directly. The decision of what to do with this knowledge must be yours alone. But know that I trust your wisdom to choose what is best for the land we have both loved. The final paragraph brought tears to her eyes. If you find yourself in desperate circumstances, this document represents security for your future. But if you can find happiness in our simple mountain life, remember that the greatest treasures are often invisible to those who seek only profit. Mara set the letter down and looked around the cabin that had been their sanctuary. Jake stood near the window, gazing out at the snow-covered landscape with the contentment that had marked his recovery. Penny dozed near the fire, occasionally nuzzling Hope as he explored the cabin with boundless curiosity. This was wealth, not the mineral deposit sleeping beneath the mountain, but the living, breathing family they had created together through the hardest winter any of them had experienced. The copper and precious metals had been there for millions of years, and would remain for millions more. But this moment, this perfect balance of survival and love, was ephemeral and irreplaceable, yet practical concerns couldn't be ignored. Her carefully rationed supplies would run out within weeks, and spring was still a month away at minimum. The aspen bark flower had extended their resources, but it wasn't a long-term solution for feeding 4 lives through what could be an extended cold season. The mineral rights represented immediate security, enough money to buy supplies for years, to improve the cabin, to provide veterinary care for the animals without the desperate improvisations that had marked Jake's illness. She could hire help with heavy work, expand the pasture, even establish the animal sanctuary she'd begun dreaming about during the long winter evenings. But selling the rights would also mean mining operations on their mountain. Heavy machinery, roads cut through pristine forest, the constant noise and disruption of industrial activity in what had been their peaceful refuge. The mountain that had sheltered and sustained them would be scarred by the pursuit of wealth buried in its depths. Hope wandered over to where she sat, his small hooves clicking on the wooden floor. He pushed his muzzle against her hand, seeking the attention and affection that had become as natural as breathing during their months together. In his dark eyes, she saw trust so complete it took her breath away. "What would you do, little one?" she asked softly. "Would you trade your mountain home for security?" Hope's answer was to rest his head against her knee, a gesture of such pure contentment that it seemed to illuminate the choice before her. He had been born into this life of hardship and uncertainty, but he had never known anything but love, protection, and the simple joy of existing in harmony with the natural world. Jake approached, as if sensing the weight of her contemplation. His recovery had been complete, but it had also transformed him from a resigned animal awaiting slaughter into a creature with purpose and dignity. The mountain life had given him value beyond his commercial worth, had restored his health and spirit in ways no amount of money could quantify. Even Penny, initially stressed by their unconventional living arrangements, had found peace in the routine they'd established. She had successfully raised her foal in conditions that would have challenged experienced breeders, guided by instincts that no amount of technological intervention could improve. The mineral rights deed felt heavy in her hands, weighted not just with potential wealth, but with the power to transform everything they had built together. Thomas had hidden this choice from her to preserve their happiness, but now the decision was hers alone. Outside, the wind carried the scent of approaching spring, subtle changes in temperature and humidity that spoke of snowmelt still weeks away, but inevitable. Soon the trails would open, and contact with the outside world would resume. The mining company would undoubtedly approach her, armed with geological surveys and financial projections designed to make their offer irresistible. But sitting in the lamp-lit cabin, surrounded by the gentle breathing of animals who had taught her more about love and resilience than any human relationship since Thomas's death, Mara realized that she already knew her answer. The hidden deed had revealed more than mineral wealth. It had shown her the true value of what they'd created together. No amount of money could purchase the transformation she'd experienced, the rediscovery of purpose and joy that had marked every day since she'd impulsively bought 2 donkeys destined for slaughter. Thomas's letter had asked her to choose what was best for the land they both loved. As she folded the document and placed it carefully in Thomas's journal, Mara understood that the choice wasn't really between wealth and simplicity. It was between fear and faith, between the security that money promised and the deeper security that came from living in harmony with the natural world and the creatures who shared it. The mineral rights would remain hers, a safety net if truly desperate circumstances arose. But for now, the greatest treasure lay not beneath the mountain, but within the walls of their small cabin, measured not in dollars, but in the immeasurable currency of love freely given and gratefully received. The last letter Thomas had written but never sent lay open on the kitchen table, its final paragraph illuminated by the soft light of early dawn. Mara had read it countless times since discovering the mineral rights deed, but this morning the words seemed to carry new weight and urgency. Remember that I married a woman whose heart was large enough to love the unwanted and forgotten, Thomas had written. If this knowledge brings you the means to extend that love to other creatures who need sanctuary, then perhaps my secret will serve its highest purpose. The spring thaw had begun in earnest, filling the mountain air with the sound of running water and the promise of renewal. Snow still covered the ground around the cabin, but the worst of winter's grip was loosening day by day. Soon the trail to Cedar Ridge would be passable, and with it would come the outside world's demands and expectations. Hope had grown considerably during their months of isolation, his gangly foal proportions giving way to the sturdy build of a young donkey. He spent increasing amounts of time outside, exploring the expanding areas where snow had melted to reveal the mountain landscape he'd never seen without its winter covering. His curiosity and intelligence impressed Mara daily. He learned quickly, responded to his name with enthusiasm, and had developed an uncanny ability to sense her moods and needs. "You're going to be something special," she told him, as he investigated a patch of early wildflowers emerging from the melting snow. "I can feel it in every fiber of my being." Jake had not only fully recovered from his winter illness, but seemed to have gained a new lease on life. The gentle old donkey had become Hope's mentor and protector, teaching him through patient example how to navigate the mountain terrain and respond to Mara's guidance. There was dignity in Jake's bearing now, purpose in his daily routines that spoke of an animal who understood his value extended far beyond commercial worth. Penny, too, had blossomed in her role as mother and member of their small family. Her protective instincts were strong but not anxious, and she had developed a remarkable ability to anticipate potential dangers while allowing Hope the freedom to explore and learn. The 3 animals had formed bonds that would be difficult to break, a family unit as solid and meaningful as any human relationship Mara had known. As she prepared for the journey down to Cedar Ridge, the first since her desperate trip during the early winter storm, Mara felt the weight of decisions that would affect not just her own future, but the fate of her animal companions. The mineral rights deed was carefully tucked into Thomas's old leather satchel, along with the geological surveys and legal documents that proved her ownership of wealth she'd never imagined possessing. But more important than those papers were her plans for using that wealth, sketched out during long winter evenings when the animals slept peacefully around the fire. Thomas's final letter had spoken of extending her love to other unwanted creatures, and that vision had taken shape as a comprehensive sanctuary that could provide refuge for animals that society had deemed worthless or expendable. The Thomas Henderson Memorial Animal Sanctuary would occupy a carefully selected portion of their mountain property, leaving the most pristine areas untouched while providing facilities for rescued animals to live out their lives in peace and dignity. The mineral rights could fund construction of proper shelters, veterinary facilities, and living quarters for the staff who would help her manage an expanded rescue operation. Her negotiations with Apex Extraction Corporation would be complex but straightforward in principle. Limited mining access to specific areas in exchange for substantial royalty payments that would fund the sanctuary in perpetuity. The company would get their copper and precious metals, but under strict environmental controls that preserved the mountain's essential character and beauty. "It's a good plan," she told Jake as she brushed his winter coat, removing the thick underfur that had protected him through the harsh months. "Thomas would approve, I think." The practical preparations for their descent to Cedar Ridge required careful coordination. Jake and Penny were strong enough for the journey, and Hope was eager for adventure beyond the familiar boundaries of their clearing. But traveling with 3 animals on mountain trails, still treacherous with snowmelt and mud, would demand all of Mara's accumulated knowledge of mountain travel. She packed supplies for several days, uncertain how long the negotiations might take or what complications might arise. The business aspects of her plan were beyond her experience, but she'd arranged for legal representation through Dr. Martinez, who had remained in contact with Thomas's professional network in Denver. More challenging than the business negotiations would be the emotional aspects of rejoining human society. After months of isolation with her animal family, Mara had changed during the winter in ways she was still discovering, grown stronger, more confident, more certain of her own judgment and capabilities. The woman who would meet with mining executives and lawyers was different from the grieving widow who had impulsively bought 2 donkeys to save them from slaughter. "We all changed, didn't we?" she asked Hope, as he explored the pack frame she was adjusting for the journey. "You'll be meeting people for the first time, little one. I wonder what you'll think of them," Hope responded by nuzzling her shoulder, a gesture that had become his standard expression of affection and trust. His confidence was remarkable for such a young animal, born into uncertainty, but raised with such consistent love and security that he approached new experiences with curiosity rather than fear. The final evening in the cabin before their departure felt ceremonial, weighted with significance that went beyond the practical aspects of their journey. Mara prepared their last meal in the quarters that had sheltered them through the hardest winter any of them had experienced, watching as lamplight played across the familiar walls and furnishings that had witnessed their transformation from strangers into family. She read aloud from Thomas's journals, sharing observations about spring weather patterns and mountain wildlife that would help them navigate the changing season. Jake and Penny listened with the attention they'd developed for her voice during the long winter evenings, while Hope dozed contentedly near the fire that had been their source of warmth and comfort for so many months. "Tomorrow we go back to the world," she told them, "but we go together and we go with purpose. No matter what happens down there, we come back home as a family." The mineral rights deed lay on the table beside Thomas's photograph, both documents representing different aspects of the legacy he'd left her. The deed was his gift of security and options, while the photograph reminded her of the love and partnership that made any decision meaningful. Outside, the night sounds of the mountain filled the air. Owls calling across the valley, the distant howl of a coyote, the constant whisper of wind through pine branches. These sounds had become the soundtrack to their shared life, as familiar and comforting as heartbeats, but beneath those familiar sounds was something new, the gurgle and rush of snowmelt, the drip of water from eaves, the subtle shifts in temperature and humidity that spoke of winter's retreat and spring's advance. Change was coming whether they were ready or not, but they would face it together. Mara banked the fire and settled into her bed near the animals, listening to their quiet breathing and feeling the profound contentment that had become her constant companion. Tomorrow would bring challenges and decisions that would determine their future, but tonight they were safe, warm, and united by bonds stronger than any legal document or business arrangement. The wooden cross around her neck settled comfortably against her chest as she drifted towards sleep. No longer a weight of grief, but a reminder of faith rewarded. Thomas's love lived on, not in the mineral wealth he'd hidden, but in the courage and compassion he'd nurtured in her. Qualities that had guided her through their hardest months and would sustain her through whatever lay ahead. The last sound she heard before sleep was Hope's quiet snore, innocent and trusting, the sound of a life that had known nothing but love since its first breath. Tomorrow, she would use Thomas's hidden legacy to ensure that other animals could know that same security and peace. The sanctuary would be built, not just with money, but with the knowledge hard-won. During their winter together, the understanding that love and practical care were inseparable, that dignity and survival could coexist, and that sometimes the most important. Wealth was invisible to everyone except those wise enough to recognize its value. The mining contract lay spread across the hotel's conference table like a map of competing futures. Mara sat facing 3 representatives from Apex Extraction Corporation, the leather satchel containing Thomas's mineral rights deed positioned carefully at her elbow. Jake, Penny, and Hope waited in the hotel's stable, cared for by young Timothy Bradley, while their fate was decided in this wood-paneled room that smelled of cigars and ambition. "Mrs. Henderson," said James Morrison, Apex's lead negotiator, "this is an exceptionally generous offer. $200,000 for full mineral rights, plus a 5% royalty on extracted materials. You'd be financially secure for life." The contract was indeed generous by any conventional measure, but Mara had spent the morning walking Cedar Ridge's main street with new eyes, seeing things that months of mountain isolation had taught her to notice. Behind the mercantile, she'd observed a pen of animals awaiting transport to slaughter. Horses too old for ranch work, cattle deemed unprofitable, even a small flock of sheep whose wool was no longer in demand. "I appreciate your offer." "Mr. Morrison," Mara replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the decision before her. "But I have a counter-proposal that I believe serves both our interests more effectively." Morrison exchanged glances with his colleagues, clearly surprised that this mountain woman would negotiate rather than simply accept their offer. They had underestimated her, just as the townspeople had underestimated her decision to buy 2 donkeys with her last dollar. "I'm willing to grant limited mining rights to specific areas of my property," she continued, spreading her own carefully prepared map across the table. "These sections contain the richest copper deposits according to your surveys, but they represent less than 20% of my total acreage." The mining engineers leaned forward, studying her proposed boundaries. She had chosen wisely. The areas she was willing to lease contained substantial mineral wealth while preserving the most pristine sections of the mountain for her own purposes. "In exchange," Mara said, "I want 15% royalties instead of 5%, a 20-year limit on extraction activities, and binding environmental protections for the remaining 80% of the property. Additionally, your company will fund construction of wildlife and domestic animal sanctuary facilities on the preserved sections." Morrison's eyebrows rose. "Mrs. Henderson, I'm not sure you understand the financial implications of what you're proposing. 15% royalties and construction funding would significantly reduce the project's profitability." "I understand perfectly," Mara replied, thinking of Hope's trusting eyes and Jake's dignified recovery. The question is whether Apex understands the value of what I'm offering. She had prepared for this moment during the long winter evenings, studying Thomas's business correspondence and consulting with Dr. Martinez about the legal aspects of mineral rights negotiations. The mountain had taught her patience and careful observation, qualities that served her well in this sterile conference room. Your alternative is continued legal battles with other property owners in the region who are organizing to resist mining development, she pointed out. My offer provides immediate access to proven deposits with a willing partner who can help you demonstrate responsible environmental stewardship. The truth was that her research had revealed growing opposition to Apex's operations throughout the Colorado Rockies. Environmental groups, local governments, and property owners were forming coalitions to resist unrestricted mining development. Her willingness to negotiate could provide the company with a showcase project that might ease their difficulties elsewhere. Morrison requested a recess to consult with his superiors by telegram. While the mining representatives stepped outside, Mara remained in the conference room, gazing out the window toward the mountain trail that led home to her cabin. Somewhere up there, 3 animals waited for her return, trusting that she would make decisions in their best interests. Dr. Martinez entered during the break, carrying legal documents he'd prepared based on their previous discussions. You're asking for terms that would make this one of the most restrictive mining agreements in Colorado, he warned. They may reject your proposal entirely. Then we'll find another way, Mara said simply. But I believe they need this deal more than we need their money. When the Apex representatives returned, Morrison's expression was carefully neutral. Mrs. Henderson, we're prepared to accept 12% royalties and a 25-year extraction period. The environmental protections and sanctuary funding are acceptable, provided the costs don't exceed $50,000. It wasn't everything she'd asked for, but it was enough. 12% royalties on the copper deposits would generate substantial annual income, and $50,000 would fund construction of basic sanctuary facilities. Most importantly, the environmental protections would preserve the mountain's essential character, while allowing her to fulfill Thomas's vision of extending her love to other unwanted creatures. We have an agreement, Mara said, extending her hand to Morrison. When can we begin construction of the sanctuary facilities? As she shook hands with the mining executives, Mara thought of the empty coin purse that had started this journey, her willingness to sacrifice her own security to save 2 animals nobody else wanted. That impulse had led to this moment where she was negotiating to save not just Jake and Penny, but countless other creatures who would find refuge on their mountain. The contract that would transform their lives was taking shape, one carefully negotiated clause at a time. The sanctuary sign took shape beneath Mara's careful hands, each letter carved into seasoned pine with tools that had once belonged to Thomas. Thomas Henderson Memorial Animal Sanctuary, the words read, with smaller text below. Founded 1887, a place of refuge and renewal. The wood was smooth and warm beneath her fingers, carrying the scent of mountain forests and the promise of new beginnings. Jake stood nearby, watching her work with the patient attention he brought to everything she did. His transformation from a sick, abandoned donkey to the dignified elder of their small family was complete. But more than that, he had become something approaching legendary among the townspeople of Cedar Ridge. Word of his recovery and Hope's birth had spread through the community, creating a narrative of survival and renewal that resonated with people facing their own hardships. You're famous now, Mara told him as she smoothed the carved letters with fine sandpaper. People are calling you the miracle donkey. Penny approached from the pasture where she'd been grazing with Hope, her maternal duties now balanced with the confidence of an animal who understood her place and value. The young donkey, no longer quite so young, as spring had given way to early summer, bounded ahead of his mother with the enthusiasm that characterized everything he did. Hope had become the unofficial ambassador of their small sanctuary, greeting visitors with such genuine friendliness that even those who came skeptical about the project found themselves charmed by his personality. His intelligence was remarkable, but it was his capacity for joy that truly impressed everyone who met him. The construction of the sanctuary facilities had progressed steadily through the spring and early summer. The buildings were simple but well designed. A proper barn with individual stalls for sick or injured animals, a medical facility equipped with the latest veterinary supplies, and comfortable quarters for the staff who would help Mara manage the expanded operation. More importantly, the sanctuary had already begun fulfilling its mission. 3 horses, too old for ranch work but still healthy enough to enjoy peaceful retirement, grazed in the upper pasture. A small flock of sheep, rescued from slaughter when wool prices dropped, provided companionship for each other and entertainment for Hope, who had appointed himself their unofficial guardian, Mrs. Henderson. Sarah Collins approached from the main trail, leading 2 elderly mules whose owners could no longer care for them. I brought Samson and Delilah like we discussed. The mules were thin but alert, their eyes holding the wariness of animals who had experienced both hard work and uncertain treatment. Sarah had contacted Mara after hearing about the sanctuary, explaining that the mules' owners were moving to town and couldn't take the animals with them. "Welcome home," Mara said softly as she approached the new arrivals. Samson, the larger of the 2 mules, allowed her to stroke his neck while Delilah maintained a cautious distance. They would need time to understand that this place was different from their previous experiences, that here their value wasn't measured by their ability to work, but simply by their existence as living creatures, deserving of care and respect. Hope immediately appointed himself as the welcoming committee, approaching the newcomers with the confident friendliness that had made him so effective at helping other animals adjust to sanctuary life. His presence seemed to communicate safety and acceptance in ways that human words couldn't match. The financial arrangements with Apex Extraction had proved even more beneficial than Mara had anticipated. The mining operations, conducted under strict environmental guidelines, generated monthly royalty payments that more than covered the sanctuary's operating expenses. Additionally, Apex's commitment to environmental responsibility had brought positive attention to both the mining project and the animal sanctuary, creating a model that other companies were beginning to study and emulate. Dr. Martinez arrived in the afternoon with legal documents establishing the sanctuary's formal status as a charitable organization. "You've created something remarkable here," he said, watching Hope demonstrate his latest trick, opening and closing gates, for an audience of sheep who seemed genuinely impressed. "The state's agricultural department wants to use your facility as a model for other rural animal rescue operations." The recognition was gratifying, but for Mara, the true measure of success was visible every day in the contentment of the animals who had found refuge on their mountain. Jake's dignified presence provided stability and wisdom to newcomers. Penny's maternal instincts extended to all the sanctuary's residents, and Hope's irrepressible joy created an atmosphere of optimism that seemed to accelerate every animal's healing process. As evening approached, Mara completed the final touches on the sanctuary sign and positioned it at the entrance to their property. The carved letters caught the golden light of sunset, and the simple wooden marker seemed to glow with purpose and promise. Standing beside the sign with Jake, Penny and Hope gathered around her, Mara felt the profound satisfaction of a vision realized. Thomas's hidden legacy had made the sanctuary possible, but the inspiration had come from a simpler source, the willingness to act with compassion even when resources were scarce and outcomes uncertain. "We did it," she told her original family. The 3 animals who had taught her that love and practical care were inseparable. "Your home is safe, and now it's a home for others too." The wooden cross around her neck caught the evening light as she reached out to embrace Jake's sturdy neck. No longer a burden of grief, but a symbol of faith, rewarded and love multiplied beyond anything she had imagined possible. The guest register sat open on the porch table of the sanctuary's visitor center, its pages filled with names and addresses of people who had come to see what love could build on a Colorado mountainside. Children from the Cedar Ridge School had signed their names in careful script after learning about animal care from Hope, who seemed to understand that his role included education as well as entertainment. Ranchers had recorded their observations about innovative approaches to animal welfare, while families simply wrote thank you notes for afternoons spent in the peaceful company of creatures who radiated contentment. 6 months after the sanctuary's official opening, the morning routine had expanded but retained the personal touch that made each animal feel valued as an individual. Mara walked through the facilities as dawn painted the mountain peaks with rose and gold, checking on residents whose stories had brought her both heartbreak and hope. Jake, now approaching his 20th year, had assumed the role of elder statesman with grace and dignity. His recovery from that desperate winter illness had been so complete that visiting veterinarians used him as an example of what proper care could accomplish. He moved through the sanctuary grounds with the calm authority of an animal who understood his importance to the community, greeting newcomers with patient kindness and providing stability during their adjustment periods. "Good morning, wise one," Mara said, offering him his favorite treat, an apple from the tree Thomas had planted behind their cabin years earlier. Ready for another day of being a good example? Jake accepted the apple with the delicate precision that characterized all his actions, then followed her to the next pasture where Penny supervised the activities of several younger animals. The mother donkey had developed into a remarkable caretaker, somehow sensing which newcomers needed gentle encouragement and which required firm boundaries. Her maternal instincts had expanded to encompass every creature that entered the sanctuary, creating an atmosphere of nurturing that accelerated healing and adaptation. Hope, no longer the gangly foal born during that desperate winter, but a sturdy young donkey approaching his first birthday, had become the sanctuary's unofficial ambassador. His intelligence and enthusiasm made him perfect for educational programs, and his genuine affection for human visitors helped overcome the skepticism that some people brought to discussions of animal welfare. "You're going to have a busy day," Mara told him as he demonstrated his gate-opening skills for her morning inspection. "The Portland family is bringing their children to meet you, and Dr. Martinez wants to discuss that article the Veterinary Journal is writing about our medical protocols." The sanctuary now housed 23 animals: donkeys, mules, horses, sheep, and even several goats whose previous owners had been unable to care for them properly. Each animal had arrived with its own story of hardship or neglect, but all had found not just shelter, but genuine care that restored their health and dignity. The medical facility that had been built with mining royalties rivaled many professional veterinary clinics, equipped with modern diagnostic tools and staffed by rotating volunteers from veterinary schools throughout the region. Students came to learn not just medical techniques, but the importance of treating each animal as an individual deserving of respect and comprehensive care. But the sanctuary's true success was measured not in medical equipment or visitor numbers, but in the transformation visible in every animal that called it home. Eyes that had been dull with despair now sparkled with curiosity. Bodies that had been weakened by neglect grew strong on nutritious food and regular exercise. Spirits that had been broken by harsh treatment rediscovered trust and even joy. Mrs. Henderson, Mary Blackwood, the young veterinary student who served as Mara's primary assistant, approached with the daily medical report. "Samson's wound is healing perfectly, and Delilah has gained another 5 pounds this week. Dr. Phillips thinks they'll both be ready for the main pasture within days." The 2 mules who had arrived thin and weary had blossomed under the sanctuary's care, their transformation serving as another testament to what was possible when animals received not just adequate, but loving attention. Their recovery had been documented by the State Agricultural Department as part of a study on innovative approaches to animal rescue and rehabilitation. As the morning progressed, Mara found herself standing before the guest register, reading entries from visitors who had been touched by what they found on the mountain. A rancher from Wyoming had written, "Never seen animals so content. Will be implementing some of these care practices on my own spread." A teacher from Denver noted, "My students learn more about responsibility and compassion in one afternoon here than in weeks of classroom discussion." But it was the simpler entries that moved her most. A child's carefully printed message read, "Hope the donkey made me happy when I was sad about my dog dying." An elderly man had written, "Lost my farm last year. Seeing these animals thriving gives me hope that new beginnings are possible at any age." The wooden cross around Mara's neck caught the afternoon sunlight as she closed the register and walked back toward her original cabin, now expanded with additional rooms to accommodate staff and visiting researchers. The simple jewelry piece no longer represented grief, but continuity, the ongoing presence of Thomas's love and wisdom in everything the sanctuary had accomplished. Hope bounded up to join her walk, his enthusiasm undiminished by the morning's activities. At nearly a year old, he retained the curiosity and joy that had marked his first uncertain steps in the cabin where he was born. But now those qualities were channeled into helping other animals discover their own capacity for happiness and trust. As evening settled over the mountain, Mara sat on the cabin's expanded porch, surrounded by the gentle sounds of animals settling into their night routines. Jake's contented snort from the nearby pasture, Penny's soft nickering as she checked on her various charges, the rustle of sheep moving through the grass, all created a symphony of peace that spoke to the success of their unlikely family's journey. The empty coin, purse that had started this adventure, sat in a place of honor on the mantle, no longer a symbol of sacrifice, but of faith rewarded beyond all reasonable expectation. Sometimes the most important investments were made not with careful calculation, but with open hearts willing to act on love. Despite uncertain outcomes, the guest register would fill with more names in the days to come, recording the visits of people who found inspiration in the simple truth that every life has value and every act of mercy creates circles of blessing that extend far beyond their original intention. But tonight, as the mountains settled into the quiet rhythms of a successful day, Mara Henderson was content to listen to the breathing of creatures who had taught her that the most profound wealth was measured not in dollars but in the immeasurable currency of love freely given and gratefully received.